Miami, home of pristine beaches, sunshine, and Jewish Cubans. In Miami, Cuban culture is everywhere. It influences everything from the food, to the music, to the overall atmosphere of the city. But what many people don't know is Miami is home to a community of Jewish Cubans who commonly refer to themselves as Jewbans. You probably have a lot of questions. Jewbans? There are Jews in Cuba. And how did this community start growing in Miami?
Meet Clara Posner, one of our summer 2022 public history interns at the Institute of Southern Jewish Life. You may also recognize Clara from our past episode on Southern Jews and country music. Clara just graduated from Carleton College with a degree in psychology, and she spent this summer diving deep into the history of Miami's Cuban Jewish community. She'll take us on a journey through time, place, music, and memory as we explore this particular facet of the Southern Jewish experience. Welcome to the ISJL Virtual Vacation.
The Cuban Jewish population played an important role in Miami's history and the development of South Florida. Since the mid-20th century, Cuban Jews have stood out as a link between Miami's large Cuban population and its large Jewish population. We are going to share the story with the help of people who are closely connected to the Cuban Jewish community. For many people, including my interviewees, this migration story doesn't fit into a neat box or follow one single narrative. It is impossible to share the totality of the Cuban Jewish experience in one episode. So I hope this video piques your interest and inspires you to learn more. When and why did Jews start moving to Cuba? And what did the Jewish community on the island look like? To answer these questions, I spoke to Ruth Bahar, acclaimed anthropologist and writer based in the University of Michigan, who has spent the last 2 decades exploring the history of Jews in Cuba. Ruth was born in Havana, Cuba in 1956 and immigrated to the United States when she was 5. From Sephardic and Ashkenazi parentage, she has an intimate knowledge of both Cuban Jewish communities. Ruth was able to provide us with some essential background information on this topic. Although there is some speculation about conversos or crypto-Jews living in the Americas as early as the 15th century, the first documented Jewish presence in Cuba was in the late 19th century.
But what we know for sure is that the first Jews to live outwardly and publicly as Jews were actually American Jews who came to Cuba at the end of the Spanish-American War, which was 1898. And in that war, essentially, the United States invaded to get Spain out of Cuba, because Spain, of course, had been the colonizer. And so they got Spain out of Cuba. Cuba became independent. And there were many American Jews that were part of the Spanish-American War that fought on the American side. And some of them decided to live in Cuba or decided to open businesses in Cuba. After the Spanish-American War, it became possible to have different religions in Cuba. So you didn't have to just be Catholic. In fact, the Americans brought Protestantism to Cuba. So Protestantism arrives in Cuba after the Spanish-American War. In the early 1900s, the first Protestants arrived to Cuba, and they converted Cubans. So there are Cuban Protestants, there are Cuban Christian Scientists in Cuba, and Cuban Jehovah's Witnesses, etc. So these other religions enter Cuba, and so does Judaism. At that time, in the early years of the 20th century. And the first were American Jewish expatriates who opened stores and businesses and lived in Cuba and often went back and forth between Cuba and the United States. Famously, there was a restaurant called Moishe Pipik, and it was an American Jewish kosher restaurant in Old Havana, opened by these expatriates. So that's very interesting. And then soon after, the first group of Jews to arrive from Europe were these Sephardic Jews from Turkey, So they start coming in the teens, in 1910s, and settling in Cuba. They come to Cuba because that's when the Ottoman Empire dissolves, and Turkey becomes very nationalist, and the Jews begin to worry about what their situation is going to be there in Turkey, and so many choose to come. It's also the period after World War I and just before World War II, so there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of difficulty just in general, not specifically because of Judaism, for those leaving from Turkey. So many leave Turkey in that period and settle in Cuba. Mostly they go to Havana, but some go to the eastern end of the island, to Santiago de Cuba. They open up a synagogue called Shevet Ahim in 1914 in Old Havana. And they all live in the Old Havana area because the men become street peddlers, and they peddle blankets and clothes and anything they can carry on their backs and shoulders, and they become peddlers. And so they live in Old Havana because that's right next to the port. And so the port brings in, the ships bring in the goods, then they get the goods from the port, and then they go off and sell them. So it makes perfect sense to live in that area. It was also more affordable for recent immigrants to live in Old Havana, which was a more working class area at the time. So that's the first group, and they come, and particularly Sephardic Jews are interesting because they specifically choose to go to Cuba, and some also go to places like Mexico, but the ones that come to Cuba, they choose Cuba because they speak Ladino or Judeo-Espanol, and that is an old Spanish mixed in with various languages that they have learned in the course of their diasporic journeys, because Sephardic Jews, some end up in Italy, and some end up in Turkey, and some end up in other places in North Africa and Morocco and so on. Syria even, and so, but they hold on to the Spanish language with all these other accretions that later become part of it, and so that's what we know as Ladino. And so the Sephardic Jews go to Cuba because they've got a kind of Spanish that they speak, this Ladino, and they arrive in Cuba and they can be understood speaking Ladino, this Spanish that they have continued to speak even though they haven't lived in Spain for 500 years, and yet they're speaking a form of Spanish. And so they arrive and they settle in, very well into Cuba because they've got some notion of the language, though they do have to also learn some, different words in Cuban Spanish and so on, but they, they feel they can be part of that culture. And then subsequently, the Jews from Eastern Europe start immigrating to Cuba. And they go to Cuba because there's an immigration act passed in the United States in 1924 that creates a quota system and limits the number of people that can come from certain countries like Poland, for example. And so, of course, many of the Jewish people in this period are trying to leave Poland, but they can't come to the United States because there's this quota system, and a very small number of people with a Polish passport can enter the United States. So they can't come to the United States. This is really where they want to come. They want to be part of the United States, but the United States doesn't make it easy to immigrate here. And so what happens? They learn that they can go to Cuba, and that Cuba is very close to the United States, and if they can just get over to Cuba, eventually maybe they can get to the United States. And so that's why many choose to go to Cuba. And what happens is that for some of these immigrants, Cuba becomes a trampoline, and they are in Cuba for a few years. They get a Cuban visa or passport, and then they move on to the United States. But others, thousands and thousands did that, but then others decide that they like Cuba and we don't need to go anywhere else. This is kind of what happened with my family. It's like, well, we found our America in Cuba. Why do we need to go anywhere else? And so they settle in Cuba, and these are the people that, create their community there, open up synagogues, open up schools, Jewish day schools, theater. There was even Yiddish theater, radio programs in Yiddish and in Ladino. They just recreate their whole culture in Cuba because they feel they have found a home in Cuba. And to me, it's so striking how these communities in a very short period of time, because between the teens and 20s to 1961 is a very short period of time, it's 30 or 40 years, and in that period they create a really lively Jewish community, and it's incredible what they're able to do, and like how they're able to maintain a strong sense of their Jewish identity, but at the same time come to feel so much a part of Cuba.
The integration of Jews into Cuban society was also a focal point of my interview with Susana Bahar. Born in Havana, Cuba, Susana is a performer of Ladino and Latin American songs. When talking about her childhood, Susana used music as a clear example of how Cuban culture significantly influenced Jewish communities living there.
Music has been part of my life since I was a little girl in Cuba, because my home was a very musical household. My mother had a beautiful voice, and she was always singing. That is a memory of my early childhood that is very clear. She was always singing. My father did sing also, but not so well, but he liked it. But he had a brother, his oldest brother, who was a musician, not professionally, but he was a guitarist, a composer, a singer. He sang beautifully. And since I always sang, my mother said that she used to tell me that even when I was 2 years old, I already had a voice that some people would appreciate when I sang, 2, 3, 4 years old. So my uncle, Pablo was his name, taught me songs when I was very, very little, and these were very old Cuban songs. I'm not talking about children's songs, but adult songs, from what it's called La Trova Cubana, which is the very Cuban music of the beginning of the century that was so rich and so amazingly beautiful. So to give you an example of his love for me and for my singing, one time he took me to see this orchestra, only women's orchestra, very famous in Cuba, called Las Anacaonas. And I probably was 7 years old, something like that. And during the intermission, because he knew a lot of people in the music scene in Havana, and during the intermission, he asked the theater people, the organizers, if he could come to the stage with me and I would sing a song with him accompanying me in the guitar. And I was a little thing in this enormous theater. And that's, again, one of my most vivid memories of my early childhood. Or going to, we would take vacations, little summer, I don't know, maybe they were just weekends. In my mind, they were weeks. And they would rent these little cabins on the beach, and the whole family, friends, and everybody brought guitars, and we would sing at night. And again, that's my brother played the guitar as well and sang beautifully too. So it was a very musical environment. Unfortunately, it was all left behind when we left, and our lives, for all of us, changed radically.
We'll talk more about Cuban Jewish music later. Stay tuned for the end of the episode for an incredible performance from Susana Bahar. By the 1950s, the Cuban Jewish community was a prosperous, influential minority, which in its brief history had woven itself into the fabric of Cuban society. So what changed? Why did the majority of the Jewish population leave Cuba?
You know, these were Jews in Cuba who expected to stay in Cuba forever. You know, on the eve of the revolution in the 50s, they were building synagogues and expanding the Jewish cemeteries, and particularly there's a synagogue called the Patronato Synagogue, is what it's called, and by the community. And they built this really enormous synagogue, Jewish community center with a library, a banquet hall. I mean, it was and is enormous. And they were expecting that they'd be there for a very long time because they were building this Jewish community center in the mid-1950s. And then the revolution begins in 1959. And the community stays for the first 2 years of the revolution, mostly till 61. And that's when the Bay of Pigs invasion takes place. And it's at that point that Fidel Castro announces that the revolution is going to be communist. He hadn't formally declared that till 1961. And so that's when a lot of people in the Jewish community decide that they don't want to live in Cuba, they don't want to live in a communist society. And also that's the point at which stores and properties, private properties, get nationalized by the Cuban government. And most of the Jewish community at that time were merchants and small store owners, and their properties, their businesses were taken over, were nationalized or confiscated by the government. And typically they could stay and work in the store that they had owned, but most of them didn't want to do that. They wanted to be the owners. And the stories I've heard is that many people, literally on the day that their store was confiscated, left for Miami. So literally they turned the keys in to the government and they got on a plane and left for Miami and started again from scratch. So that was very true of the community. And so it's so poignant because, people of my parents' generation, now in their 80s, were expecting to stay. They were expecting to raise their kids and be in Cuba and be Cuban Jews. And, 90% of the community leaves in this mass exodus in the 60s. And then others leave afterwards. And of course, some decide to stay, but it's really a minority that chooses to stay and be part of the revolution. The majority decide that that they don't want to be part of this revolution. Maybe at the beginning they thought it was an idealistic dream that they wanted to be part of, but then they get very disillusioned, by 1961 and decide to leave.
For Cuban Jews, like other Cubans who fled during the revolution, this departure was traumatic. Ruth mentioned that for many families, the time between the decision to move and the move itself was just a few days. The Cuban government demanded that people's possessions were to be left behind, and many had personal items confiscated at the airport. In addition, the authorities could decide that certain people weren't allowed to leave. This was the case for Susanna's family.
And I left Cuba in 1965, as I said, with my mom to Venezuela, where we had already relatives. My mother had a sister living there. And my father and my brother, unfortunately, had to stay behind. My brother had just turned 15, and a new law had come out that boys between 15 and 27 could not leave the country because they were in what they call military age, and they had to do military service at one point. So my family took the decision of my mother and I leaving first and trying to get them out right away, but that didn't happen. They tried to escape in a plane and were caught. And so the family was separated for almost 15 years, unfortunately. And I lived in Venezuela with my mother all that time.
Family played a significant role in the relocation of Cuban Jews during the revolution. Many Jews who left the island chose to migrate to countries and cities where they had family and friends. I spoke with Henry Chayette, who moved to Miami from Cuba at age 4 and is currently living in South Florida, about his family's experience.
My parents were the first children of their generation to go to the United States. They got married, and immediately went to Chicago, where they had a distant uncle who got my dad a job selling clothes at the Macy's store. Right? And they spent 2 years there. And my mother decided she was going to have her first child in Cuba with her mother. That was me. So I was born in Cuba, unfortunately not in the United States. But that was the first household we shared, was that distant second cousin kind of member of the family who took my family, my mother and my dad. And then they went back to Cuba, and I was born. Following our establishment, my central family's establishment here, and my aunt and uncle, one aunt and uncle came here. Then after that, the members of our family that came were all here following Castro. And when you left after Castro took over, right, it was because there was a guy at your front door with a gun chasing you out of your house, and you had nothing to take with you but the shirt on your back. I have an aunt whose wedding ring was confiscated at the airport while they were leaving because they owned a business, and that was capitalism, not communism. My dad had many, many friends who made it to the United States who slept on our couch. My grandparents left probably 7 years after Castro. No, before that, actually, right after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 61 or 2. They lived with us for 5 years in our house. My uncle and aunt, whose business was confiscated at a clothing store, they left with nothing, stayed at our house. Every time somebody stayed at our house, the kids, there were 3 of us, had less space to live. So I was not a well-behaved child because I resented that and did silly things like throw toys at them. So, those created tremendous burdens on the families like ours of taking in your family just doubled in size.
While numerous Cuban Jews migrated to New York City and Texas, a majority of the population moved to Miami. But why Miami?
So Miami is a destination for the Cuban Jews, just like it is for all Cubans in this period. Miami is close to Cuba, definitely close to Havana, closer to the western part of the island than the eastern. So it's close, it's tropical or subtropical, not as tropical as Cuba, but subtropical. So similar climate, similar palm trees, by the ocean. There are many ways in which Miami could be a kind of mini Cuba. And in fact, the joke to this day is that Miami is North Cuba. People say that about it. So it seemed the closest. There were lots of Cubans, particularly in the wealthier classes, who already knew Miami, who had spent time in Miami and were rich enough to come to Miami to do shopping on the weekends and things like that. So there was a knowledge of Miami. There was definitely a knowledge that there is a Jewish community, that there has been a Jewish community in Miami since the 40s and 50s. So there was that knowledge. There was the knowledge, again, that Miami was like Cuba. So all of that led people to come to Miami. But many, and this is often forgotten, actually went to New York first. So there were many that did the New York immigration thing first, where there were many more business opportunities, many more job opportunities. So many went to New York. And this was true with my own family, that they went to New York in the 60s, New York, New Jersey, because of the job opportunities they could find there. But then they found that they didn't like the snow, they didn't like the cold weather, they missed, the warmth of Cuba, and there was this community forming in Miami, this Cuban community forming in Miami. And so, for example, with my family, by the 70s, so about 10 years later, an aunt and uncle, my grandparents, a bunch of people just said, no, let's get down to Miami. This cold is terrible. We don't want to suffer through these winters. And there's this community forming in Miami where you don't even have to speak English. There's a niche there for Cubans. And so I think as that Cuban niche started developing in the 60s, it became attractive to those Cubans that maybe had gone to New York first. And to those that came to Miami right away, there was just so much resemblance with Cuba, even though, of course, it wasn't a Spanish-speaking city the way it is today. Miami is, a completely bilingual city where nowadays you find not just Cubans, but people from every Latin American and Caribbean country. So you can spend a day in Miami, and in the morning you might say hello to somebody from Peru. Midday, you meet a Cuban. By the afternoon, you meet somebody from Argentina, then somebody from Puerto Rico. It's very interesting how all of the places where Spanish is spoken, you meet Spaniards also in Miami. So all the places where Spanish is spoken, you meet them now in Miami. So that hadn't happened yet in the 60s and 70s, but it was starting to form. It was becoming this community where people helped each other quite a lot to progress, where those who had more connections or more money and were forming businesses hired fellow Cubans to work for them. And so it was, definitely a secure place to be. It was like you were not in Cuba, you were in the United States, but it was as close to Cuba as you could be. While being in the United States. And so I think that was a big part of it. And because there were so many Cubans who were upper and middle class settling in the United States in that period, they wanted to hold on to their Spanish. And so it wasn't like other parts of the United States, like Texas or California, where they basically shamed people into not speaking Spanish. And that's because many of the immigrants were working class or farm workers, and they were made to feel embarrassed for speaking Spanish. I have a lot of friends, from South Texas and from that area who lost their Spanish because they were often punished in school for speaking Spanish. That wasn't the case in Miami because these immigrants thought they would be going back to Cuba one day. And so they held on to their Spanish. They taught their kids Spanish. They introduced bilingual schools into Miami. They were really very innovative in that regard. But it was all because they thought they would be going back to Cuba. And this was true even among Cuban Jews. And I saw it in my own family. For example, my parents in New York, they always rented apartments because they thought we were here temporarily. They thought that one day we would go back to Cuba. And so they didn't want to buy a house, also that they couldn't afford it, but even had they been able to afford it, they were very uncertain about how long we would be here. Even as we became citizens and things like that, there was this sense that the Castro government wouldn't last, that how could a communist system, continue to last 90 miles away from the coast of Florida? So there was this assumption that one day that system would be toppled and we would somehow return to Cuba.
When Cuban Jews arrived in Miami, the existing Jewish community wasn't entirely sure what to make of their mixed identities. The only temple that did welcome the Cuban Jews was Temple Menorah. In response, Cuban Jews established 2 synagogues of their own, Cuban Hebrew Congregation and Temple Moses. These free synagogues became the anchors of the Cuban Jewish community. To learn more about the Cuban Jewish congregational life in Miami, we spoke to Rabbi Daniel Hadar, who is the rabbi at Temple Moses in Miami Beach, the Sephardic congregation of Florida. Temple Moses was established in 1968 by Cuban Jewish refugees, and it continues to serve a significant Cuban Jewish population in the present.
It's very much a part of the Miami story. And today, Miami has exploded to an international city. People live everywhere. And, part of our pitch in today's world is simply that This is your community, no matter where you live. So it's no longer a localized community. It's just not. And that's okay. The idea of community has expanded.
While many Cuban Jewish families in Miami talked openly about their experiences in Cuba, this wasn't the case for everyone. When I spoke to Mark Newman, who was raised in Miami and whose mother moved to the United States from Cuba, he described the limited role his Cuban Jewish identity played during his childhood in Miami.
And I actually didn't meet another Cuban, Jewish or otherwise, until high school. My high school had no Cubans. I think in that huge high school of 3,500 kids, I think there might have been 3 of us who were Hispanic, and the other 2 were not Cubans. Growing up, I was as an American, a young guy. I played all kinds of sports. I was president of my high school. I went to Jewish summer camp in Cleveland, Georgia, a place called Camp Coleman that still is around. A lot of kids from Miami still go there. I was the athletic director after having been a camper for a number of years, and I worked maintenance crew when I was 15 up there one summer. But I didn't speak Spanish, and that was part of it, I guess. But as I mentioned earlier, my mother never took us to any of the Cuban Jewish events, birthdays, none of that. And I think, again, because my father was quite a gringo, and she just sort of kept that life to herself, that she didn't pass on any of that really to me. She never talked about Cuba except to say that when I was little and I would go down there, I was a skinny little guy, and they called me, the word in Spanish, flaco or flaquito, means skinny one. And she told me the last time I was down there, they put me in a summer, like a school, like during the summer when I was down there. And the kids made terrible fun of me because I didn't speak Spanish, and I was this skinny little American kid. I don't remember the experience. I just know that I did that. The only thing I can remember is the fish peddler who would come by pushing a cart with fresh fish along the cobblestone, road there, and be selling, fresh fish. My grandparents, I don't think they ever mentioned Cuba to me. And I think you have to understand that for them, first Poland, then Cuba, these were mixed experiences where there was a lot of hard work and sacrifice. And in Cuba, at least, working on the railroad for 15 years. And then unceremoniously, they have to exile again twice in a lifetime. Most of us, we don't ever exile once.
Mark also mentioned that he didn't start really learning about and understanding his Cuban Jewish identity until later in life. I'm curious about how Cuban Jews, especially those who were born and raised in Cuba, shared memories of Cuba with their families. I spoke with Elias Chayet, a former ISJL education fellow, who is a rabbinical student at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, and also happens to be Henry Chayet's son, about this intergenerational legacy.
For a long time, it was inseparable. My Judaism and the Cuban heritage were so interconnected because my mom's extended family wasn't Jewish. So everything Jewish that we did that was in Florida was also Cuban. Every holiday meal had a Cuban twist to it. Beans and rice and everything. It was just part of who we were. It was like rooted around food and family mostly. Everything, like, we were a big, loud Jewban family. At every meal, we were yelling over each other at the kids' table, and at the adult table, it was the same thing. And we have a really close bond with our immediate family as well as the extended family and cousins. We've all stayed relatively close, and even though we've grown older and kind of moved around, like that bond of standing at the kitchen or being with family at the beach or whatever it was, it's still there. So for the longest time, I thought stuffed cabbage was a Cuban food. I thought stuffed cabbage was like uniquely Cuban. And then I got older and realized that, oh no, that's actually like the Eastern European Ashkenazi influences that were brought. And I was like, oh no, what are you talking about? This is something my bobe made, and it was very uniquely a Cuban Jewish thing. And I learned later in life it was not at all. It was something that everybody had experienced, that you could get it at Jewish delis, which was unheard of, and I would have gotten shamed for in my family because bobes was so much better. Like we learned how to make gefilte fish together, but she refused to grind the fish herself. One day when I was young, I was like, Bobe, can we make gefilte fish together? I want to be there with you from scratch. Can we do it? She looked at me and laughed and shook her head and said, absolutely not. We're not grinding fish. That's disgusting. But here's this frozen loaf we can start from. That's as scratch as you're going to get. And like learning how to like having a dish called picadillo. It's like a ground beef with olives and raisins, like a savory sweet meal that's one of my favorites. It was there around all the time. It was something that I learned to make with her, and was one of the fond memories with my cousin and I learning to make that dish with her, standing over the giant pot of hot, almost stew, in the middle of Miami heat. Or like it was a fun, really fun memory.
The Chayette family also shared some of Henry's mother's Cuban Jewish recipes with us. They're available on the ISJL Virtual Vacation website and at the link in the description on this video. Elias also spoke about the experience of visiting Cuba with his father.
It was a really meaningful trip to be there with my dad. When we were in Havana, we walked and found what used to be the Jewish quarter. He was like, "Oh, this is where the butcher used to be." Then we walked down a side street, and he's like, "That's where my grandparents' apartment was." And all that was left were 3 walls and a staircase and no front facade. There was no, it looked like it had been uninhabited for a very long time. It was crumbling. And it was a little depressing. It was kind of tough to see that, especially when he shared memories of going there and like having fun and playing with his cousins as they were little kids. We were at a lunch, and there was, I remember it looked like it was a house. It didn't seem like a restaurant. We were eating lunch on somebody's front porch. And then a band comes with 2 guys with guitars, and they come start singing, and they sing a song that my dad knows, and he starts singing along in his bad voice, and you just see him start crying. And it was a really special, like clearly it was meaningful for him, which made it meaningful for us. Yeah, that was a great trip. I wish though my grandmother would have been able to come with us, because that would have been fascinating. She said she would never go back until Castro died. But she passed away before Castro died. Actually, that's an interesting story. It was around Thanksgiving. I don't remember what year it was, but the whole family was in Florida for Thanksgiving, and we hear Castro's dead. Fidel finally died, and in Jewish culture, you don't really celebrate the death of someone. But my dad said, we're going to go to Cayo. We're going to go to the Cuban neighborhood to experience what this is like. And people were there banging pots and pans and partying and celebrating the death of this tyrant, which was a really challenging thing to experience as a 20-year-old. It never affected me individually, but I understood the trauma that Fidel and the regime caused for so many people. And so it was a unique thing being at this party, partially as a third-party observer, because it didn't affect me, and also like knowing what happened to my extended family who stayed and welcomed Fidel into Havana Square, and everything taken away from them. So it was a very unique and strange experience.
Music is a common thread in Cuban Jewish culture. The Cuban songs that Susanna performs continue to connect her to her family.
But a few years ago, I started introducing these concerts where I would sing songs from both repertoires. And when I started doing that, I can tell you that the first songs that I go to are those old Cuban songs that I learned when I was a child in Cuba. And those are still today some of my favorite songs to sing. So there is a very strong connection with those very few years that I spent in Cuba in my early childhood in what I do today. Absolutely, absolutely. I do music I love. I would never sing a song that I don't like, because there's so many beautiful songs written in the world. Why choose something you don't love? You can choose something you love. So I always do things I like, but I can tell you that there is also a component that influences, and it has to do so much in the music I do. And I always feel that it's like I'm honoring my ancestors, and that strong feeling of keeping them present in my life through my music.
I'm excited to share with you a song from Susanna's concert, Latino Meets Ladino, which presented a flow between Sephardic and Cuban music. Susanna described the music in the concert as the perfect way to represent herself artistically.
Has echado en el abandono, aunque ya han muerto todas mis ilusiones. En vez de maldecirte con justo encono, en mis sueños te colmo, en mis sueños te colmo de bendiciones. Sufro la inmensa pena de tu extravío y siento el dolor profundo de tu partida, y lloro sin que tú sepas que el llanto mío tiene lágrimas negras como mi vida. Quieres dejar, yo no quiero sufrir. Contigo me voy, mi santa, aunque me cueste morir. Si tú me quieres dejar, yo no quiero sufrir. Contigo me voy, mi santa, aunque me cueste morir. Tú me quieres dejar, yo no quiero sufrir. Contigo me voy, mi santa, aunque me cueste morir. Contigo me voy, mi santa, aunque me cueste morir. Tú me entregaste la vida, yo te entregué el corazón. Te quiero tanto y te quiero más que un montón. Que tú me quieres dejar, yo no quiero sufrir. Contigo me voy, mi santa, aunque me cueste morir. Yo no quiero
Throughout this project, I was fascinated by the ways art and writing can be used to explore this unique combination of cultures. In addition to being an anthropologist, Ruth Bahar is an amazing poet and agreed to share a poem from her book, Everything I Kept.
This one is called Fears, and it's a bilingual poetry book, Everything I Kept, Todo lo que guardé. So it's Fears in English and Miedos in Spanish. I'll read it in English. I have so many fears of the night, of growing old, of seeing those I have loved fall ill or die, of my own death. Those are fears everyone has, but I am also tormented by stranger fears, of my heart pounding too quickly, of unexpectedly going blind and not finding my way home, of losing my memory before I find the time to write the story still dormant in me, of raging winters which will never end. I am also afraid of getting wet in the rain, standing on my head, running down staircases. Police, soldiers, and immigration officers terrify me. If you took my fears away, I would be weightless and free. You would see me dance like a dry brown leaf, and then I'd blow away in the autumn wind.
The history of Miami's Cuban Jewish community reflects the diversity of the American Jewish experience.
It's more than just Ashkenaz or Sephardic or Mizrahi. And I don't think that's about Cuban Jews in general. I think we put those labels on things to try and help us understand, but it often stops us from asking deeper questions. Because even in Ashkenaz, there were different experiences in different regions of Ashkenaz. Like the Polish experience might be a little bit different than the Latvian experience. That might be a little bit different than the German experience. And then what happens after that? That's not the end of the story. That's a piece of it, sure, but for a long time, Jews weren't allowed into America. What happened in between? Where did they go? How did that next step affect the culture of Judaism? I think it's just asking the questions and not taking those labels as the end-all be-all of Jewish culture and heritage.
This experience of diaspora and migration has built a strong and tight-knit Cuban Jewish community.
Trauma brings people together, and I think this is a small community that has experienced trauma in one way or another, and I'm grateful that I was born in the U.S. and that I'm technically, because my dad was born in Cuba, I'm technically second-generation American because he immigrated to the States. I'm grateful that my dad worked his tail off to provide for us the childhood that he wasn't able to have because his family had just moved to the country. And really, I think I mentioned the American dream earlier. It is something that I firmly believe in, and I think that having an immigrant father and a family who is recently immigrated to this country plays a big impact in my life.
It's hard to imagine winning the lottery, but getting a ticket to Miami was winning the lottery.
Thank you so much to Ruth Bahar, Susanna Bahar, Henry and Elias Chayette, Mark Newman, and Rabbi Daniel Hadar for sharing their stories and memories with us. Special thanks to Clara Posner, who brought this story to life with her research, reporting, and interviews. I would also like to thank Stuart Rockoff, Carol Anderson, and the entire staff of the Mississippi Humanities Council. Our 2021 and 2022 Virtual Vacation episodes were funded in part by a grant from the Mississippi Humanities Council through support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Their ongoing support of our work is so needed and appreciated, especially as we invest the time and resources to bring you this show for free each month. We are so grateful to be here in Mississippi and to be beneficiaries of their incredible work. As the year comes to a close, I hope you'll consider making a donation to the Institute of Southern Jewish Life to support our slate of engaging and meaningful arts, culture, and public history programs for and from the Jewish South. And I hope you'll share your favorite episode from this year with a friend or family member to help us spread the word about the show. We couldn't do it without your support. We'll see you next time for more stories from the Jewish South. But first, one last poem from Ruth Bahar.
This one is called Freedom, Libertad. So I had a long time in my life that I was afraid to go to the ocean alone, and I'm not sure what that was exactly about, but I was afraid to go by myself. This is what this poem is about. Freedom. At last I went to the ocean today, all alone. Why did I wait so long? Such beauty could have been mine days and days ago. But at least I went. I sat in the sand and opened my palms. I waited. I forgot I had been afraid. Soon I stopped waiting and felt freedom. Vast, huge, unknowable, ravishing, divine.